1337 and Edward III has just had his French lands confiscated. Normally, such a conflict would be resolved by an English king acknowledging that they held these lands as a subject of the French king. Well, not this time. Edward III would try the different tactic of declaring himself to be the rightful king of France instead. His claim came via his mother, Isabella, which the French dismissed because inheritance wasn't matrilineal. Naturally, Edward's claim meant the beginning of a war, the 100 Years' War. Couple of quick facts. First, the war actually lasted for 116 years. And second, the war wasn't continuous and there were many years of peace between the three main phases of the war. So at first, Edward struggled to raise the money for an invasion and so had to delay any military action until 1340, the year he formally declared himself the King of France. This year saw the first major battle of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Sluys. This battle involved the English requisitioning merchant ships and outfitting them for war. These ships then sailed for the French navy stationed at Sluys. The result was the destruction of the French fleet in England securing the Channel. After this, Edward landed in France, but nothing much really happened on either side because war is expensive and no one could afford it. A truce was declared, but it didn't last due to the death of the Duke of Brittany in 1341. Brittany was semi-independent of France and both sides backed rival claimants to the duchy. Edward landed there in 1342 and took this land before another truce was signed the next year. Negotiations towards a permanent peace between England and France broke down mostly because Edward didn't want peace. In 1345 the war resumed, but the English weren't very successful, barring some victories in Gascony. The next year saw the main English thrust when Edward took a large army and landed here in Normandy. Edward's advance was not meant to capture and hold land, but was instead what is called a chevauchée, which is when an invading army essentially set everything on fire. Edward moved north before King Philippe's much larger army caught up to him and the two sides clashed at the Battle of Crécy. Crécy was not only a surprising English victory, but it was a decisive one, seeing many French nobles and the King of Bohemia killed in hails of arrows from English and Welsh longbowmen. After this victory, Edward marched north and laid siege to Calais, capturing it the next year. Calais was an extremely important gain for Edward because it provided a gateway into France at the shortest crossing point from England, making future campaigns cheaper. English good fortune wasn't limited to France, as the King of Scotland, who had been at war with England since 1332, was captured by the Archbishop of York at the Battle of Neville's Cross, just outside of Durham. The feeling of celebration would be cut short by the introduction of the Black Death in 1348, which was kind of terrible. The destruction wrought by the plague meant that no major military campaigns could be undertaken by either side for many years. In 1350, King Philippe died and was succeeded by his son, King John II. There was some skirmishing and piracy over the coming years, and both sides tried to sue for peace, but neither could agree on Edward owing homage. In 1355, Edward, the Prince of Wales, better known as the Black Prince due to the armour he wore, launched a devastating chevauchée and decimated French lands. He was confronted by King John, who had a much larger army, at Poitiers in 1356. The battle here is one of the most famous English victories in history, mostly because the French king was captured, thus continuing the long streak of kings who were called John being terrible. Capturing King John was a huge bonus for the English, and the ransom demanded was huge. French luck worsened when the country descended into civil war, and rioting meant that King John's ransom couldn't be paid, thus invasion. In the end, the French agreed to the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which ended the first phase of the war, called the Edwardian phase. This treaty gave Edward all of this land in return for Edward dropping his claim to the throne and lowering John's ransom. King John would never be released, since in 1364 he died in London and was succeeded by his son Charles V. Peace between England and France would be broken in 1369 when King Charles called the Black Prince, now the Prince of Aquitaine, to Paris. The prince refused and so, war. Under Charles, the French did much better with an early victory in 1370 at Pont-Vaillant. Shortly after this, the Black Prince became unwell and returned to England in 1372. This second phase of the war, called the Caroline phase, saw the English territories reduced from this to this by 1376. This year also saw the Black Prince die, and the next one, Edward III, died as well. The throne passed to Edward's grandson, who was crowned Richard II at the age of 10. 3 years after this, Charles V of France died and was succeeded by Charles VI, who was only 11. So having two children ruling two kingdoms at war was not a recipe for stability. Many nobles vied for dominance over the new monarchs, but in England, Richard's uncle, John of Gaunt, acted as a stabilising force. Gaunt was an accomplished general and was also married to the daughter of the King of Castile, through whom he claimed its throne. He attempted to take up his claim in 1381 with the help of the Portuguese, whom England had made an alliance with in 1373, which was confirmed by the Treaty of Windsor. Incidentally, this treaty is still in effect today, making it the oldest active alliance in the world. Ultimately, John of Gaunt was unsuccessful in taking the Castilian throne, and by 1389 he was back in England. Political divisions, along with the financial pressures of war, meant that Richard II made peace with the French, which would last for the rest of his reign. Richard's reign was consistently plagued with issues surrounding his nobility, who had stripped him of significant power. France also had issues with King Charles VI, who was prone to bouts of madness. Because of Charles's condition, a regency was established, which led to a power struggle between the Duke of Burgundy, who controlled these lands, and the Duke of Orleans, who controlled these. Back in England, Richard was regaining some of his lost powers and ended up exiling John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, in 1398. The next year Gaunt died and Richard disinherited Henry, which was a bad idea. Henry returned to England to reclaim his seized lands, most of the English nobility sided with him and Richard was overthrown. There was some debate over who would succeed Richard, but ultimately Henry succeeded him as Henry IV, the first monarch of the House of Lancaster. But as far as the 100 Years' War was concerned, Henry wasn't very important. Suffice to say that there was some fighting, but it was sparse and also the English kept losing despite the civil war in France. Henry IV died in 1413 and was succeeded by his son, Henry V, who is one of England's most famous kings. Henry was willing to make peace with the French, providing they gave him this land. Shockingly, they said no, and so war it was. In 1415, Henry landed in Normandy and seized Harfleur before moving north to Calais. Before he got there, Henry was cut off by the French army and they clashed. This battle, the Battle of Agincourt, is known for being one of England's greatest military victories. The English were heavily outnumbered, but Henry's army was 80% longbowmen. The French casualties were massive and the French nobility was devastated by the deaths and imprisonment of many of France's leading officers. Henry didn't continue his campaign afterwards and sailed back to England with his hostages. Henry returned to France in 1417, this time setting out to conquer France entirely and have himself crowned king. Because France was still undergoing civil strife, the English were able to capture most of Normandy except for Rouen, which fell in 1419. 1419 was an important year in the war because it saw the Duke of Burgundy assassinated on the orders of the French heir, the Dauphin of France. The Duke's successor, Philippe, sided with the English and declared his support for Henry as the King of France along with many other French nobles. This was the final nail in the coffin for the French and resulted in the 1420 Treaty of Troyes. This stated that Henry was to be the regent and heir to the French throne, that Charles's children were to be disinherited and that Henry would marry Charles's daughter, whom he had one son with in 1421, also called Henry. Not all of the French accepted Henry as king and resistance to him continued, with both the English and French winning victories. Henry was not just a conqueror and managed to overcome many challenges at home. One such challenge was the Southampton Plot. This saw several nobles attempt to overthrow Henry and replace him with Edmund Mortimer, a cousin of Richard II. This plot was foiled before it could begin in earnest, although they would have had trouble anyway since Mortimer didn't want to be king. Henry also made great efforts to increase the use of the English language in government. Another issue which Henry V had to deal with was the continuing rise of Lollardy, a religious movement which disliked the church as an institution. Henry saw Lollardy as a threat to stability and so found a clever way of stopping Lollards from continuing their protests, burning them alive. John Oldcastle is the most notable of those burned since he was an old friend of Henry's. Henry returned to France to strengthen his position in 1421 and it was there that he suddenly died of disease the following year. 2 months later Charles VI died and so the infant Henry VI was supposed to be crowned the King of France as well. In 1428, in an attempt to crush dissenters, the English laid siege to Orleans, but the defenders were relieved the next year by an army which was special for one simple reason: it was partially led by a woman. This woman was Joan of Arc, commonly known as the Maid. The English were soon after crushed at the Battle of Patay, and many French nobles switched allegiance to the Dauphin, who was soon after crowned King Charles VII. In 1430, Joan of Arc was captured by the Burgundians and handed over to the English. Since she had claimed to receive visions from God, she was tried as a heretic, and in 1431 she was burned at the stake. In 1435, the Pope attempted to bring the war to an end, but both sides refused. What did happen during the negotiations was that the Duke of Burgundy made amends with Charles VII. Thus, England's most important ally had deserted, making the French significantly more powerful. After this, the French recovered the initiative and recaptured large swathes of land. In 1444, a truce was signed which was supposed to last until 1450. However, the English broke the truce in 1449 by launching a military action in Brittany. This gave the French the excuse they needed, and the next year they retook Normandy and shortly afterwards crushed the last English army at the Battle of Formigny. All that remained now was Gascony and Calais, and the former would not last much longer. The killing blow came in 1453 when an English army was destroyed at the Battle of Castillon. This was mostly due to the advancements in the use of gunpowder weapons and superior French tactics. For many historians, Castillon marks the end of the 100 Years' War, but be aware no treaty was signed in its immediate aftermath. England's territories had gone from this, to this, and back to this in 116 years. All that remained was Calais and the Channel Islands. The reason why this is often considered the end of the war was that there was no longer any realistic chance of England retaking France. The ambition to do so would, however, remain until the 19th century. The 100 Years' War has many important legacies. It fostered a sense of English identity, one centred on the English language, which began to replace French as the language of the ruling class. Whilst the French victory did not kill off any English ambitions to the lands in France, it does mark the point in which England starts to be viewed as an island nation. The 100 Years' War also marks a period of immense restraint by the French, who managed to go this entire period without naming a single King Louis. But much like the peace, this wouldn't last. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. There are some books in the description below if you'd like to learn more.